Thank you so much, and good morning from my side to everyone. Good morning depends on the location in the world where you are, of course. So welcome anyway. My name is Matthias Bohlen. I'm an independent consultant. I spend my time with teams who say, yeah, we want to make good software. We want to have fun. We want to come out with the software in time, and we won't go nuts in the process. So teams like that, they often struggle with naming. There's a saying by Phil Carlton that says there are only two hard things in computer science: cache invalidation and naming things, right? So this is almost incomparable. Naming things is really hard. In computer science, you have components like modules, like classes, like everything. And how do we name them? What can we do to give good names? Because bad names confuse the team, they take time, they take money. That's really, really difficult. So I invite you to my whiteboard here. I have prepared something for you. I'd like to break down the problem of naming into several subproblems, so that you can solve them individually for your team. And at the end, I have a recommendation for you what to do on Monday when you come back to the office. So let's switch over to Miro. Please join me here on the board in the welcome section. Here on the board, we have a small exercise. Let's collect some sample names. Some names from your experience, some names from your projects. And please put good names on green stickies and bad names on red stickies, on these magenta stickies. So have fun for a few minutes on this exercise. What could be good names? What could be bad names? I can think of one bad name that's called utility. Yeah, customer master would be an interesting name. Yeah, managers, data cleaning stuff. You can duplicate these stickies with Command D on a Mac or Control D on a Windows machine, so that you get more of them. Yeah, a helper. What does that even mean? What does it mean to the customer, to the domain experts who are talking to us when it's about requirements for our software? Let's have some good names too. What are typical good names for domain concepts? Like, for example, in the domain of transport, where you transport goods on the road or by train. What would be a good name in that domain? Yeah, create order, validate order. These would be good method names. Get user by ID. Yes, this would also be a good method name. A ticket, a shipping unit, right? All kinds of that stuff. really names from the target domain. Sometimes we are forced to give technical names like a provider or something, or UI controller, but these should be considered really technical and not be used in discussions with our users and other domain experts. So after this quick exercise, let's proceed to why should we care? Why should we care about these things at all? Let's take a product name from the market, a very popular one, the Windows subsystem for Linux. It's a Microsoft product, so this quiz here, please don't answer if you work for Microsoft. What do you think? Is this a subsystem of Windows or a subsystem of Linux? The Windows subsystem for Linux. Interesting, right? And does it run Windows executables on Linux or Linux executables on Windows? What do you think? It's a difficult question if you don't know this product, right? So I'd like to reveal the answer here. The Windows subsystem for Linux lets developers run a GNU Linux environment, including most command line tools, utilities, and applications, directly on Windows, unmodified. This is interesting, right? The Windows subsystem for Linux. And I heard the title for the first time. I thought this must be something running on Linux, right? If it's for Linux, it must be running on Linux. Okay, so maybe I can run Windows tasks on Linux. No, this is an old concept. Wine and so on did that already. So, and so on. And after a while, I found out, no, it's just the other way around. This is a common problem in naming. When you say the X plugin for Y, it's not clear if X is the source or the target, right? So we have to be very careful with naming. Bad names cause all kinds of problems. I talk about some typical problems in bad naming. For example, confusing communication. If you give something a bad name, then the other ones in the team or the stakeholders or the domain experts, they will think something different about than what you're talking about. So the communication is slower, it's confusing. Onboarding for new team members is also a big thing. What if you get a new team member? How fast do they get into the domain, into the language, into all this context-specific stuff? The code base, for example, with bad naming, the code base becomes difficult to understand. And when I, as a developer, when I misunderstand a name, I think, oh, this does something complicated. Maybe better I copy it and put my solution into the copy, right? And suddenly the software becomes worse than before. Bad names also cause mental overhead, right? It's more difficult for my brain to process a bad name than a good name. A good name is easily captured by my brain, and it doesn't overuse my brain capacity. Semantic decay is a big problem in architecture, in programming, in requirements definitions. What if the semantics of one word or one phrase changes over time, right? In the beginning, when 3 or 4 people were on the project, everything was fine, right? They were agreeing on the semantics of those words. But what if somebody comes in who wasn't there before? He or she talks a little bit differently about things, and suddenly the semantics of stuff changes. Sometimes teams really actively rename stuff and say, oh, this is here has been a semantic decay. We should get this name really precise and change it. But changing names can be difficult because they are already in the code, in the documentation, in the UI, in the language of the team, and so on. So bad names cause all kinds of problems here. What about good names? Good names really keep things healthy, right? For example, when I see a good name, it tells me where I can add my own code when I'm a developer. it really sets the right expectations for me. I really understand the responsibility of a piece of software. So I can extend it, or I can modify it, I can fix bugs. Or in the communication between the domain experts and us developers or architects, it conveys the right idea if we have good names. It also strengthens the team. It makes them fast. It makes them strong. It saves time. It saves money. Lots of good things. A counter example or an example might be the Johnny Cash song that I have here on the top right. There's a song by Johnny Cash saying "A Boy Named Sue." It's about a father who gave the name Sue to his son in the Wild West, 1850 or so, and the son had really a hard life with that name, because your name Sue or Susie, as a man, it becomes difficult. So there's a great line in the song that says, "Some gal would giggle and I would get red, and some guy would laugh and I would break his head. I tell you, life ain't easy for a boy named Sue." It goes on like that. It's more speaking than singing, and it's a great song with great humor. But at the end of the song, the guy really becomes strong because he had to fight so much in the Wild West with his name. So it might be a counterexample or an example for good naming, indirect good naming. So when we look at good names and bad names, what are the things that need names in the first place? I've collected here some so-called stereotypes from various areas. For example, on the left, we have command, query, and event. This comes from CQRS event sourcing, from the CQRS and event sourcing world. These are stereotypes from there. Commands are things that change something. Queries are things that return data. And events are important events that happen in the domain. At the top, you see from DDD the typical 9 domain-driven design stereotypes like module, aggregate, service, value, object, entity, and so on. And they also need to be named, right? Things of those stereotypes also need to be named. At the bottom right, you see from object-oriented programming, or from programming in general, you see components, interfaces, objects, classes, attributes, methods, and functions if you work in functional world. Also, all these things need to be named, as well as process actors and signals from the real-time processing world. So all these things need names. Isn't that amazing? And it's our responsibility as a team and the responsibility of the stakeholders and domain experts to really give good names to all these things. So what makes a good name really good? It's an interesting question. Fortunately, I found an evolving book. It's not yet finished, but somebody has decided that naming is important. And this somebody is called Tom Benner. And he has begun to write a book about naming things, right? The hardest problem in software engineering. And he, on his website, he has 7 important characteristics of a good name. I mentioned them here. A good name is consistent. It's consistently used. Something has a single name as a concept, and in all places where you use the same concept, you also use the same name. You don't use alternating names. You're trying to avoid aliases. Or aliases? I don't know in English. English is my second language. Specificity is also a thing. A name should neither be too specific, too narrow, too small, or too general in nature. If it's too general, like object, it can mean anything, right? So a team should thrive to, or should try to create the names with the right level of specificity. Brevity. We often have big discussions about how long should a name be. In the early days in Fortran, it was only 6 characters allowed, and very synthetic names like AB123XY came out of this, right? But Today we can have names as long as we want. So it's now our decision. How long should it be or how short should it be? Austerity, I had to look up this English word for me as a German. I made a note to myself that says not too clever, right? In German, it could be bescheiden. A name should be bescheiden, austerity. Austerity means don't invent clever names. Don't call them like planets in the universe, or don't call them like the latest hero from Starship Enterprise, something like that, right? But call things really aptly. Name them aptly. They should really be a plain, simple name for the concept. Yeah, austerity can mean plain and simple. Searchability. Did you ever search for a name like object? It's almost impossible, right? Or recently I used a product. It was a workflow machine, I think, and it was named Temporal. When I Google Temporal, I get all kinds of hits. It's really difficult to search. So searchability is also a thing. For example, if you're searching your code, if you're searching your documentation, if you're searching the UI sketches, and so on, searchability, a good name should easily be found in code and docs. And first of all, of course, understandability. People should be able to understand the name. The problem about naming is that names are only valid, or words in general, are only valid inside a certain context, right? This is why we, in domain-driven design, talk about so much about bounded contexts. A context is the area where different people agree on the meaning of a word. That comes from linguistics. When people agree, for example, in the same team, when they agree, yes, a customer, yeah, we know what a customer is. A customer is someone we can sell our product to. But if you go into a different team, into a support department, they would say, no, customers are those people who are causing problems. Okay. So in different contexts, the same word can mean different things. So understandability is only possible within a context. There's no universal understandability of a content of a name. But nevertheless, in the right context, a name should be really good, understandable. And of course, pronounceable. A name should be easy to pronounce, not something like ubiquitous. For example, a ubiquitous language in domain-driven design, I always find it difficult to pronounce the word ubiquitous. So make your names also easily pronounceable. I think these are really good criteria for that make a name really good. Let's take a minute or so and put some stickies here on this board with your own criteria. Do you think that something is missing here? And what do you think would be nice to add to these criteria here? On the left side of the board, you have the sticky note with the dog ear. There you can see, there you can put something. Oops, somebody has moved the screen. Okay, I forgot to lock it, I think. Interesting. Oh yes, company language and abbreviations are always a problem. If someone says, "Yeah, let's call this BST," and what the heck is a BST, right? These three-letter acronyms. Market standards, yes, they are also they are a good thing. If in a certain market there are market standards, we should use them because they are domain specific. Common schema would be nice. Yeah. Maybe also a glossary would be a nice thing, right? But it's not a criterion that makes a name good, but it's kind of a tool, right? So I'll zoom out a little bit so that I can see what you're working on. Yeah, decide on the language. Yeah, which natural language should be used? I always recommend to use the language of the target market that you're approaching. For example, if you write software for Germany, take German. If you write software for the whole world, okay, take English, and use the names in your daily discussions that are specific to your target market. Translations of specific terms, yes, interesting. Popularity in the context, yes, also nice criterion. Yeah, I can see you can find your own criteria. That's very good. That's an important thing for each team to decide what are our criteria for good names, right? Okay, so let's stop here and go to the next question. I think this will be interesting for most of you. How do we find good names? And when I approached this session here for today, I thought, okay, how can we break this down? How can we make it some kind of universal rules? And I didn't find them. I have seen that naming is really context specific. So I give you more a way to approach it than really hard and fast rules. So I think that's better. A good name can be derived from the stereotype of the element. So let's say you're in domain-driven design and you say, okay, we have modules, entities, value objects, services, repositories, and so on. And in your team, you could decide, how should we call a module? What should we call a domain concept like an entity or value object? And so on. You could derive rules for the stereotypes of your elements. Next thing would be the category that it belongs to. We will talk about categories soon. And what about the concept it represents? And that's the most important input for a good name. It should sound like the concept behind it. And finally, what kind of language element is it? Is it a noun? Is it a verb or an what is adjective? Yes, or an adverb. So the language element is also important to choose good names. And there could be a way from domain language to naming the things. For example, there's a sentence in a healthcare domain language that says, the doctor gave the patient a standard dose of flu vaccine. That's a sentence in the domain language. We could decompose that into the natural language elements first and say, what are the nouns here? Doctor, patient, dose, flu, vaccine. And we could identify the verbs. There's only one here. It's called give. And there are adjectives like standard, for example. What's a standard dose? It's an agreed upon dose, right? Where people have agreed from the medical sector, they have agreed what a standard dose should be. The problem that we have here with the word give is that's a very general word. It violates the criterion of specificity, right? Give is much too general. And to solve this, I would say in this situation, it would make sense to take give and vaccine and create a new, or replace it by the new verb vaccinate, right? There's a normal verb called vaccinate. So doctor.vaccinated left parent patient, comma, flu vaccine dot standard dose, closing parent. This could be a statement in the programming language. Let's take Java, for example, here. Classes are in uppercase, verbs and instances are in lowercase. So there are some naming conventions already going on in each programming language, but it's more about writing names, not about inventing names. So what I'm trying to achieve here is to get a way to invent good names, to create good names. So here you could replace the very neutral word give by vaccinate, which is much more concrete in this domain. Another approach could be we take the stereotypes. For example, when we have commands, a command should sound like do something, right? An imperative form. A query could sound like find something, find customers by revenue, right? Find me all customers that have a revenue of more than 100,000 in the last year. Or an event, it could sound like something happened. So from the stereotype of things, you could derive rules in your team to say, how do we name commands? How do we name queries? How do we name events? This is a simple rule these are simple rules that can be discussed with the domain experts too. They are not much technical or technological, but they can be domain rules formulated in domain language. Same thing for repository, for example. Somebody in my trainings, when I give domain-driven design trainings, somebody suggested a repository should be called like the plural form of what's in it. So you shouldn't say, and the guy said to me, you shouldn't say customer repository, but simply call it customers. Customers.find by revenue. Okay, I said, yeah, why not? And he said to me, yeah, for example, I'm calling you Matthias and not Matthias person, right? So avoid those suffixes. I said, okay, nice idea. I don't know whether it's universally applicable to avoid those suffixes. For example, what about services, right? Services could be named like doing something, but doing something could also be the name for a method. So I tend to append the suffix service in that case. Doing something service, and so on and so on. So take this chart, for example, into your team and say, how do we name an instance of a repository, a service, an entity, a value? Or what do we call commands, queries, and events? Stereotypes are a good way to think about good names. Next thing, we could also think about categories. Right? Categories of things to be named. There was a good approach it's already many years ago when Peter Code and Jeff DeLuca, Eric Lefebvre, and all these people created a scheme called modeling in color, object modeling in color. For example, we take a sentence from the domain language that says, the smart salesperson completed the sale already in the showroom. Right, so right after showing the card to the customer, the sale was instantly completed. Wow. Now, Peter Code and his friends, they proposed to create categories of things. For example, the green category contains parties, places, and things. They marked all these in green. What's the common thing? They are tangible, they are identifiable, or they are players like people, for example, a person, a car, a showroom. So tangible stuff or tangible people, that's marked in green. The pink category, or the rose or pink, I don't know, are more or less about nouns that represent activities. For example, a sale, an order, a rental, an employment, or a journey. Activities have this aspect of time, right? That's why they are called moment or interval. A moment is a point in time, and an interval is a slightly longer period of time. So time-related stuff, activity-related stuff is marked in pink. The yellow category is a way of participating in an activity. So the role that someone or something plays in an activity. For example, during a sale, a person could play the role of a salesperson, or a car could play the role of a product to be sold in the sale. So it's about the roles of things. For example, a person can be a customer and an employee at the same time. They have multiple roles for a person. And the last category, the blue one, is catalog entries, descriptions. The category is called description. These are more or less labels that we put on objects that are put into catalogs. For example, a certain model of a car. I've taken as an example here an SUV, right? Or a food menu item like a pizza or a salad or something. Things that you can put into a catalog. They are descriptions. And what Peter Code and his friends proposed in those times, they said create object models and make the classes that you create colored so that you have relationships between them. For example, here a person can be the salesperson or the customer in this case. The car is the product, and the showroom is a thing. Yeah, a place. Yes, that's why it's green. And the sale is the thing that's happening, the activity that's happening. And the SUV is the description of the product. I found this quite nice to think about these 4 categories of objects. And when you discuss this with your team, you can also try to make this as a basis for choosing good names. For example, how do we call parties, places, or things? How do we call what do we call moments or intervals? For example, a sale. I really had to think about what would I call the activity of selling, or the moment when something is sold. Yeah, it's a sale. Absolutely. So sometimes finding the right word depends also on your language capabilities. In my case, English was a little difficult for me. Now, what do we get when we put all this together, right? So let's have a look what we have. We have the category that I was talking about just now. Then we got the stereotype, something like command, query, event, module, etc. We've got the natural language elements like nouns, verbs, and adjectives or adverbs. And we got the quality criteria, which are really important. Things should be understandable, consistently used, searchable, brief or long. Yeah, brevity is a subject for discussion, and so on. So you have all these four things that can help you create good names. And how could you do that? For example, on Monday, I've prepared some Monday activities for you to make this approachable. You could run a naming workshop with your team, right? You could, number one, you could motivate good naming. You could tell them who were not in my session here, people, why is good naming so important? Good communication, saving time, saving money, preserving the semantics of the names, and so on. And as an exercise, you could brainstorm with them good and bad names from their own history, because the team has a common history. Second step could be you could present the quality criteria that I showed you, these 7 criteria like brevity, clarity. No, clarity wasn't there. Consistency, understandability, and so on. And you could have them brainstorm more criteria. For example, you came up with market standards. An interesting criterion. We should use the standard words in our market, so not to confuse people. So brainstorm more quality criteria with your team. A third step could be you could present the concept of stereotypes and categories. So stereotypes like command, query, event, module, etc. Categories like party, place, thing, moment, interval, role, or description. These are fairly old, so I'm not sure that your team is old enough to have heard of that. You could then run an exercise to identify what are our stereotypes here in the architecture that we use in our team, right? It might not be domain-driven design related. It might come from CQRS. It might come from anywhere. So identify your stereotypes, your architectural vocabulary that you are using, and identify your categories. Maybe someone has a special category like signal something, right? So not a moment interval, but a signal. So people could come up with domain-specific categories that occur often. To be a category, it has to have several instances, several occasions where the stuff already came into the team. A fourth step could be brainstorm typical names from your domain language and check them, right? Check them against the qualities, check them against the stereotypes, against the categories. Take an often used word from your domain and think about it. Is it an entity? Is it a value object? Is it a service? And so on. What category does it belong to? What natural language element is it? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? And so on. And does it have the 7 qualities that we talked about? So you can take, for example, 5 words from your domain and check them so that people get into the habit of checking for the quality of names. So yeah, at the end, you can review the names and change the bad ones. That's a good one. That's a good step to do. If it's at all possible, talk to your domain experts and say, could we change this word, please? Because it's confusing for us as a team, or it's confusing for you as the stakeholders. Could we please agree on a new name? What could that be? And maybe you can propose 2 or 3 good names that you got in your discussions. And finally, write down the naming rules that you found during the workshop. For example, when someone says, our names should be English because our target market is English. Okay, write that down. Our names should not be more than 20 characters. Okay, maybe that makes sense. So write it down. Or let's say events should be called like something happened. Okay, write it down. Commands should be called like do something. Imperative form. And related to something that still has to happen. So commands must be future related. Events must be related to the past. Something happened. So write all these down, write down all these naming rules and keep them in your wiki web of the team, right? Keep them somewhere where everyone can relate to them. That's it. So these are the things to do for Monday that I can recommend to get you into the habit of good naming. And that's the end of my content for today, and I'm now open for discussions for your questions.
Hi, thank you so much. We do have a few questions and more coming in, so let's get started with our first question. How do you avoid anchoring on the first name suggested if no better name is available immediately?
Oh, good question. For example, when you have a brainstorming session, 5 people involved, and somebody proposes a name. Okay, everybody starts thinking about this name instead of thinking about their own name. One way to avoid this quite easily is hand out Post-it notes and pencils and let everybody invent their own names and then put them on the wall. Right. So this avoids anchoring. For example, announce the moment where people should put their stuff on the wall. So it doesn't. Anchoring can also happen when someone puts the first sticky on the wall, and the others start writing related stickies. Right. So please write in silence and then put everything onto the wall. This could be a way to avoid the anchoring.
Fantastic. Our next question, how would you go about refactoring a whole app?
Oh, what does that mean? Refactoring a whole app. What comes to my mind right now is the problem when you rename a word, when you change a name, you have to do it everywhere. Nothing worse than the new name in some places and still the old name in other places. This is so hard, especially for people new to the team. They see 2 names for the same concept. So how would you go about refactoring a whole app? It's cheating. I'm cheating now, right? I would avoid creating a whole app, right? I would create simple bounded context-wise modules where the naming is only specific to that belongs inside a module and not outside. Names are only valid inside a certain context, and I would create one module for each context, so that when I have to refactor, it stays inside the module. Exception, of course, what if the API of that module contains a name? This is the more critical stuff. If I change the API, the naming inside the API, then it has an impact on all the other modules of, potentially, all the other modules of the application. So in that case, I'm trying to talk to the owners of the other contexts. Let's take the example, that's another team. I try to talk to them and say, hey, we'd like to rename in our API, we'd like to rename this one concept. Let's say employee, we'd really use that as a role instead of a person. So we'd like to pull the personal data out of the employee data. And this thing is a very major change. I have to discuss that with the other teams. And it only works with, iterating, talking to each other, discipline. It's a really hard problem to refactor something across a whole application when it becomes API relevant.
Great, thank you. So we have some more questions, but there are a couple asking if they could get a PDF export of the Miro board. Would this be possible? Is this something that I can help you do after the conference?
I can do that, of course. Is there a place where I can share the link to the PDF? I put it somewhere in the cloud, and I could share a link. You can download the PDF from somewhere. Or I can just send it to you, Alison, and you can put it up somewhere.
Sure. Yep, we can put it up in the event chat as well, and reply to the questions asked with the link that you send.
Yeah, sure.
So happy to do that.
I will do the export right after the session.
Okay, let's go on to another question then. Do you have any recommendation regarding package names? Should they be plural or singular?
Package name, plural or singular? That's a good question. Let me think about that. I tend to use plural, but I'm not sure why I'm doing that. I tend to group. No. I don't. Yeah, sometimes I use plural when it's about things, but mostly I create package names from use cases, from the larger use case that's happening, right? So let's say you have a sale use case, and then I call the package domain.something.sale. And all things related to the sale, the salesperson, the product, and so on, they come into the sale package. So it really depends whether the package name sounds like a collection of things, then I use plural, or in most cases, the package name sounds like the name of a use case. And then I put it into singular form. So it really depends on what you're talking about with the package name.
Great. All right, our final question for right now is, would you really program in a natural language, for example, something like Finnish, instead of English, using a glossary? Is this really that valuable?
Yes, I would do so. If your target market is really Finnish, and you're sure that your application will never go global, then you should use Finnish as a domain language, as the natural language for your domain concepts. I can tell you a story from my experience. We created an application for that was in German, for the ASU, the Abgas-Sonderuntersuchung. It's a special examination of the quality of the exhaust gas of a car that is legally prescribed. It's prescribed by law, by German law. You have to check the exhaust gas quality from time to time. And Abgas-Sonderuntersuchung means special investigation for the quality of exhaust gas. So at first we tried to use English because our team was collaborating with people from India, and the Indian people were speaking English. So we tried to help the Indian people to understand the German concepts by translating them to English. But this was really a bad idea, as it turned out. The Indians, after a while, they discovered, hey, these Germans are talking about ASU. They asked us, what is an ASU? And we said, yeah, it's an Abgas-Sonderuntersuchung. It's a German word for exhaust gas quality inspection. Oh, so why don't we all use the word ASU? It's much simpler than exhaust gas quality inspection. And we thought, okay, so we put all those technical German names like Abgas and so on, we put them as German words, and the Indians, they created their own glossary, because sometimes a German word has such a special meaning. For example, recently in a seminar, one of the participants came from the optics domain. They were creating glasses, and he said, in Germany we have a word like Scheitelbrechwert. I thought, whoa, what's that? Scheitelbrechwert. Yeah, you could almost translate it like maximum refraction value, right? Or refraction ratio. When the light is refracted by the lens, and the lens is not equally strong in all places, and there's one maximum place where it's the strongest, right? Then that's the maximum refraction value. And it's like, oh, okay, Scheitelbrechwert, really a German-specific term. So I recommended to say, okay, what's your target market? Yeah, Germany. Okay, so put the German word in. It's much better than translating into a fuzzy English concept.
Great, thank you. Okay, our final question for the session is the language not related to developers rather than the market?
Is the language not related to the developers rather than the market? Well, I would say the language, except for the UI. The UI must be related to the market, that's for sure. But all other languages can be related to the conversation between the domain experts and the developers, right? These two must understand each other. When they misunderstand, software gets created that doesn't fit the market, because there are misunderstandings. But the UI, for example, it has to be market specific. That's for sure.
Great, thank you. That is all the questions we have. And I'd like to thank you again for your time today and your presentation.
My pleasure.
I will look for you emailing the link to download the PDF of the Miro board. So thank you again for that as well. And I wish you a great rest of the day and hope you can hang around for more of the conference.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you to all who were here and joined me in this session. And I wish you much success with your naming.